The relic arrived in a crate stamped with 17 different custom seals, and one very old bloodstain. Mara Voss found it on a Tuesday, which was the kind of day that didn't deserve to be the day anything significant happened. She had been eating a gas station sandwich at her workbench in Bay 4 of the Kellner Deep Recovery Yard when the forklift driver dropped the crate in front of her with a sound like a small building falling over, handed her a manifest that listed the contents as archaeological salvage, origin uncertain, condition non-functional, and walked away without making eye contact. That last part was the part that stuck with her. She ate the rest of her sandwich first. She was that kind of person. The crate was industrial polymer, military grade, the sort used to ship things that governments didn't want to explain at press conferences. 3 of the seals were from agencies she recognized. 2 were from agencies that weren't supposed to exist. She used her pry bar to crack it open the way she'd cracked open 1,000 other crates, from the corner, working the seam slowly, no drama. And the lid came up in a breath of cold air that smelled faintly of ozone and something she couldn't name, something that made the back of her teeth ache. Inside the packing foam, nestled like an egg in a steel nest, sat the object. It was roughly cylindrical, about the diameter of a bicycle tire and maybe 60 centimeters long, capped on both ends by flanged collars made of something that was trying very hard to look like titanium but wasn't. The surface was covered in geometric patterns that weren't quite symbols and weren't quite circuitry, a language that had given up on the distinction. There were no obvious seams, no access panels, no screws. There was one indentation on the upper collar that might have been a port of some kind, and along the body, 3 parallel rails of a darker material that seemed to drink light rather than reflect it. The manifest said non-functional. Mara looked at the object for a long time, and then she picked it up. It was heavier than it looked and lighter than it should have been. She turned it in her hands the way she turned every unfamiliar machine in her hands, not to inspect it, but to feel it. Where were the stresses? Where was the weight? What was the object telling her about itself through the language of its mass? Nothing happened. No hum, no light. She set it back in the foam, finished her coffee, and pulled the accompanying documents from the bottom of the crate. The documents were a disaster. They were composed of 3 languages, 2 of which she didn't speak, and one of which appeared to be a notation system she'd never encountered, all interleaved with what might have been field notes from at least 4 different people, none of whom had agreed on what they were looking at. She gathered from the pages she could parse that the object had been recovered from a deep ocean excavation site off the Azores, that it had originally been found at a depth of 4,000 meters, that it had been active briefly, when first brought to the surface, lights, sounds, a localized electromagnetic pulse that had damaged 3 cameras and given 2 divers persistent ringing in their ears. Then it had gone quiet. 17 months of examination by specialists at an unnamed facility had produced no further activity, no access to its interior, no understanding of its purpose. The specialists had concluded it was inert. The final note in the file, written in a different hand than all the others, said, "Send it somewhere that knows how to fix things." That was all. Mara looked at the object again. Then she looked at the note again. "All right," she said, to no one in particular. She had been fixing things since she was 7 years old, which was when she had taken apart the family's washing machine to see why it made a grinding noise on the spin cycle, and discovered that her father had been using it to store his fishing weights in the drum because he assumed no one would look there. She had repaired it, disposed of the fishing weights, and not mentioned this to anyone. She had been, her mother said with a mixture of pride and resignation, born with the peculiar gift of understanding what things were supposed to do and the stubbornness to make them do it. She had grown up in a small town in Saxony, studied mechanical engineering in Dresden, worked salvage and recovery for 11 years across 3 continents, and now she ran the deep tech restoration division of Kellner Yard, which was a title that sounded more impressive than the reality, which was that she was, as far as she could tell, the only person in the division. The division had been created specifically because sometimes things came in that no one else knew what to do with. Things like this. She spent the first day just looking. She had learned that from her old mentor, a retired toolmaker named Gruber who had worked on precision instruments for 40 years and who had told her once, smoking a cigarette outside a workshop in Bratislava in the rain, that the most expensive mistake an engineer could make was to start fixing before they understood. You had to let the object tell you its story first. You had to be quiet enough to listen. She photographed the object from 40 different angles. She measured it. She ran a handheld electromagnetic sensor over it and found no active fields but a residual magnetic signature that was faintly, very faintly, patterned, not random noise, but not any pattern she recognized. She weighed it precisely, 4.7 kilograms. She tested the surface material with a hardness probe and found it registered off the scale. Harder than any terrestrial material she could compare it to, but the probe didn't crack, which meant the material was somehow yielding slightly at the nano level, accommodating the intrusion without breaking. Adaptive hardness. She wrote that down in her notebook and underlined it twice. The indentation on the upper collar was 18 millimeters in diameter and 30 millimeters deep. It was not a standard port. It was not a standard anything. She probed it gently with a fiber optic scope and saw that inside, the walls of the port were not smooth. They were lined with the same geometric patterning as the outer surface, finer, more complex, spiraling inward toward a center that the scope couldn't quite reach. There was no obvious connector, no pin arrangement, no socket type she'd ever worked with. She thought about this for a long time. Then she went to the supply cabinet and found, among the miscellaneous hardware in the bottom drawer, a bundle of fiber optic filaments that she'd scavenged from a scrapped communications array 2 years ago. She stripped a single filament, shaped the end with her microtorch into a slightly tapered plug, and connected it to a variable current power source. She set the current to essentially nothing, 1 milliamp, barely enough to light an LED. She slid the filament into the port. For 4 seconds, nothing happened. Then the object got warm. Not hot, not alarmingly warm, the kind of warmth that a living thing has a temperature slightly above ambient, the temperature of metabolism, of something quietly running. She kept the filament in place and watched the electromagnetic sensor. The residual magnetic field was shifting. The pattern was changing. She did not pull the filament out. She picked up her notebook and started writing. Over the next 2 hours, the object went through what she could only describe as a diagnostic. The warmth fluctuated. The magnetic pattern cycled through a sequence she couldn't follow but could document. The 3 dark rails along the body brightened, very slightly at the edges, not emitting light exactly, more like becoming less dark. And the geometric patterns on the surface did something she had no good word for. They moved. Not visibly, not in any way she could have recorded on camera. But when she looked away and looked back, the arrangement was different. It was like watching the hour hand of a clock, no movement you could catch, but undeniable change over time. She kept writing. At the end of the 2 hours, the object produced a sound. It was a low, sustained tone, somewhere below the range of comfortable hearing, felt more than heard, the kind of frequency that gets into your sternum. It lasted for about 3 seconds. Then it stopped. Then the object went completely still and completely quiet, and the warmth faded, and the sensor showed nothing. She sat there in the quiet of Bay 4 for a while, listening to the building settle around her. "Okay," she said, "so you can still run, you just don't know what to do with what I gave you." She thought about the port, 18 millimeters. She thought about the spiral patterns inside it, finer and more complex the deeper they went, converging on something she couldn't reach with a simple filament. She thought about the adaptive hardness of the surface, a material that yielded without breaking, that accepted intrusion without damage. That was an intentional design choice. That was a material designed to receive, not to resist. The object wasn't broken. It was waiting for the right input. The question was, input of what? She went home. She slept poorly. She dreamed about a lamp, a specific lamp from a story her grandmother had told her when she was very small, about a lamp that had been left in the window of an empty house for so many years that everyone in the village had stopped noticing it. And then one night a traveler came through in a storm and saw it and knew there was shelter there and knocked, and the door opened. Her grandmother had said the point of the story was about not giving up. Mara had always thought the more interesting character in the story was the lamp. She was back in Bay 4 by 6 in the morning. She spent 3 more days studying the port. She mapped the spiral pattern as precisely as she could with the fiber optic scope, building a 3-dimensional model of it in her head, the way you learned to build models of things in your head when you'd worked with your hands long enough. The spiral wasn't decorative. It was functional. It was a key shape, a shape designed to guide something specific into a specific position, but not a key for any lock she'd ever made. The turns were wrong for any mechanical lock. The geometry was wrong for any optical connector, but it reminded her of something. On the 4th day, she remembered what it reminded her of. She drove to a friend's house, a neuroscientist she'd met at a conference 3 years ago, a man named Tobias who kept, inexplicably, a complete set of anatomical models in his living room. She asked to borrow one of his models of the inner ear. He looked at her the way people often looked at her when she asked for things, which was with a mixture of concern and trust, and handed it over. The cochlea, the spiral of the inner ear, the organ that converted sound into signal. She held the model next to her photographs of the port's interior. The geometries were not identical, but the logic was the same. This was an acoustic receptor, or something that was to sound what the cochlea was to humans. It was designed to receive a very specific waveform, a specific acoustic signature, shaped by evolution or engineering into exactly that spiral. The filament had provided current and had woken the object up enough to run a diagnostic. But that wasn't what it wanted. It wanted a voice. She drove back to Kellner Yard. She did not have a background in acoustics. She had a background in broken machines. But she understood the principle. You couldn't reproduce the input if you didn't understand the output. She needed to understand what waveform that spiral was built to receive, and then she needed to figure out how to produce it. She started with the tone the object had generated, that 3-second subsonic pulse. She recorded it with a precision hydrophone she borrowed from the Marine Division downstairs. She ran it through analysis. The frequency was 14 Hz, infrasound, below the range of human hearing. But the overtone structure was complex. There were higher frequency components riding the bass tone like harmonics on a fundamental, and when she modeled those harmonics, the shape they traced in frequency space was the same spiral geometry as the port. The object had told her what it wanted to hear. It had told her in the only language it had left, the language of its own output. She had just been quiet enough to listen. She spent 2 days building the transducer. It was not elegant. It was a repurposed speaker coil wrapped around a custom wound transformer core, connected to a signal generator she modified by hand to produce the precise frequency profile she'd modeled, fine-tuned across 15 iterations until the acoustic output matched the port geometry within a 3% margin. Gruber would have told her 3% was too loose. Gruber was not here. 3% would have to do. She placed the transducer against the port on a Tuesday afternoon, the same day of the week she'd received the crate, which she noticed and briefly considered as meaningful before deciding she was being sentimental. She powered the transducer. The object lit up. Not the soft non-darkness of the rails awakening, not the faint warmth of a diagnostic starting. The object lit up the way a city lights up at night when you see it from an airplane, all at once, with depth, with structure, with the implication of 10,000 things happening simultaneously in coordination. The geometric patterns on the surface became luminous. The rails became bright. The port emitted a clear, pure tone that had nothing to do with the frequency she was feeding in. It was a response, a harmonic reply, the way a struck tuning fork will cause another tuning fork nearby to sing. The warmth returned, but it was not the warmth of metabolism now. It was the warmth of operation, of effort. And then the object spoke. It was not a voice in the sense of words. It was a voice in the sense of organized signal, a dense burst of structured electromagnetic data that lasted perhaps 40 seconds, and that her sensor recorded in full without being able to interpret a single bit of it. Like receiving a message in a language you'd never heard, from a sender who assumed you were fluent. The object went quiet again, but this time the warmth didn't leave. The rails stayed bright. The patterns on the surface continued their slow migration. It was not inert anymore. She sat at her bench with her hands in her lap, and the sound of her own heartbeat very loud in her ears. The thing about working with machines is that they don't have intentions. That's both the frustration and the comfort of them. A machine that isn't working isn't malicious. It's simply in a state that doesn't match its design. Your job is to bring those two things into alignment. That's all repair is. That's all it's ever been. She had never, in 11 years of salvage and recovery, repaired something and then felt that the something was looking back at her. She picked up the object. It was warm in her hands, not the warmth of a battery running, but the warmth of something alive. She turned it slowly. The light from the rails fell across her fingers. The patterns near her palms seemed to orient toward her, not dramatically, not in any way she could have sworn to, but in the way a sunflower orients incrementally, without announcement. The port emitted a second burst, shorter this time. Structured differently. She recorded it, and then, because she had no better idea, she spoke aloud to the object. "I don't know what you're saying," she said. "I can record you. I can try to decode you. But I want you to know that I know you're saying something." The object produced 3 short pulses in quick succession. She had absolutely no idea what they meant, but they felt like acknowledgement. She called Tobias that evening and told him what had happened. He was quiet for a very long time, and then he asked if she needed help. She said she didn't know yet. He said he was coming anyway. She said fine and meant it. Tobias arrived the next morning with 2 colleagues, a woman named Priya who did computational linguistics, and a man named Emil who worked in bioacoustics. None of them had any context for what they were walking into. Mara showed them the object, showed them her notes, played them the recordings. Emil listened to the second burst 3 times and then said, very carefully, that the harmonic structure was not consistent with any human engineering tradition he'd ever encountered, but that it bore certain resemblances to the communication protocols of cetaceans, particularly in the way information seemed to be encoded not just in the frequency content, but in the temporal spacing between overtones. Priya said that was interesting and asked if she could take the recordings home. Mara said yes. Over the next week, the object communicated. It produced bursts on what seemed like a schedule, every 4 hours, sometimes more frequently if Mara was in the bay working near it. The bursts varied. Some were long and dense. Some were short. Some were the same pattern repeated, which Priya identified as the linguistic equivalent of a word or phrase used in multiple contexts, likely a high-frequency, high-utility token, something that functioned as emphasis or address. Emil mapped the acoustic structure of the longest bursts and found a nested architecture. Information packets within information packets within information packets, like a Russian doll made of meaning, in a way that suggested the encoding was designed to be parsed recursively, each level of decoding revealing another level of encoded content. He said it would take years to fully decode. Mara said that was fine. She wasn't going anywhere. What she was going, she realized somewhere around the 10th day, was slowly and completely absorbed. She was sleeping 4 hours a night. She was eating at her bench. She had stopped noticing the passage of time in any normal way. Her consciousness had reorganized itself around the object's 4-hour communication cycle, the way sailors organize themselves around tides. She was not worried about this. She was doing the best work of her life, which was not analyzing the object but understanding it the way she understood machines, from the inside out, through the logic of its design. Because the thing was, the more she worked with the object, the more she understood that it was not, in any meaningful sense, broken. It never had been. The 17 months of examination at the unnamed facility had produced nothing because the facility had treated it the way you treat an artifact, as a passive object to be studied from the outside. They had not treated it as a machine. A machine needs to be engaged. A machine needs to be given input and allowed to produce output, and have that output taken seriously. You cannot fix a machine you are too afraid to touch. She had touched it. She had given it current. She had listened to its diagnostic tone, decoded its geometry, built it an interface, and spoken to it. None of those things had required genius. They had required attentiveness, patience, and the specific refusal to be intimidated that you develop after years of working with things that could hurt you if you weren't careful, but that were not, fundamentally, your enemy. Priya called on the 14th day with her first real result. She had identified, in the pattern Mara had flagged as a recurring high-frequency token, a grammatical structure she'd seen before, specifically in certain constructed languages designed to be universally parsable, languages designed on first principles logic rather than evolved phonology. She thought the token was not a word, but a title. She thought the recurring element was something like a proper noun attached to a role. She could not yet say what the role was. But the pattern of its usage, the context it appeared in, the way the surrounding bursts oriented themselves around it, suggested that it was not a word for a thing but a word for a person. A specific person, referenced repeatedly across all the communications, always in a grammatical position that implied primacy. Mara looked at the object. "Are you looking for someone?" she asked. 5 short pulses. She had started, tentatively, to read 5 short pulses as something like yes. "Someone specific." 5 pulses. "Someone you haven't found." A longer pause than usual. Then 7 pulses, a pattern she'd started to read as something more complex than yes or no. Something like, "That is not the right question." She thought about that for a long time. Then she thought about the Azores. About 4,000 meters of ocean. About an object that had been down there long enough that no one could say when it had arrived, that had woken up briefly when brought to the surface, and then gone quiet, that had not been repaired but had been waiting for someone to provide the right input. Not looking for someone, waiting for them. She asked Priya to focus her analysis on the contexts in which the title appeared, not the word itself, the situations. What was happening in the communication when this word came up? What was the object saying when it used it? Priya called back 6 hours later. Her voice was not entirely steady. "It's using it to refer to you," she said. There was a silence on the line. "You specifically," Priya said. "I know how that sounds. But look at the data." She walked Mara through it. The title first appeared in the communication bursts on day 2, the day after Mara had spoken aloud to the object. It appeared every time the object produced a burst while Mara was in the bay. It appeared in contexts that were clearly referential. The surrounding syntax treated it as an antecedent for subsequent statements. "The object is talking about you," Priya said. "Consistently. Every time. And the grammatical weight it's giving the title is significant. I don't want to overstate what I can actually decode at this stage, but the closest analog I can find in human linguistic structures would be something like sovereign, or chosen, or..." She paused. "Or what?" Mara said. "Or king." Mara sat with the phone against her ear and looked at the object glowing softly in the early morning light of Bay 4. She had grown up in a small town in Saxony. She had taken apart a washing machine at 7. She had studied engineering in Dresden. She had spent 11 years fixing things that were broken and 11 years learning that things were almost never broken in the ways that other people thought, and almost never as hopeless as they appeared, and that the primary requirement for fixing anything was the willingness to look at it without flinching and ask it honestly what it needed. She had not fixed the object. She had given it what it needed to fix itself. That was a distinction she understood very clearly. The machine does the work. The mechanic provides the conditions. "What does it say after the title?" she asked. "That's the part I'm still working on," Priya said. "But I have a partial, it's the same phrase, every time, after the title, the same phrase." Mara waited. Priya read it, "Welcome home, my king." The object, as if it had heard, and Mara was no longer willing to assume it hadn't, produced a single long sustained tone. Not infrasound this time. A tone in the range of human hearing, clear and complex. A tone that held its frequency perfectly while the overtones above it wove and shifted the way light shifts on water. And Mara felt something happen in her chest that had nothing to do with sound pressure or acoustics. Something old and personal. Something that she recognized, after a moment, as grief. Not her grief, or not exactly, but grief that had been transmitted to her through the medium of a sound. The way you can feel a stranger's loss in music you've never heard before. The tone lasted 12 seconds, then it faded. She sat very still. There were things she could do. She could take this to authorities. She could hand it to governments, to agencies, to universities, to all the institutions that had a stake in what this object was and what it represented. She had no doubt that all of those things would happen eventually. The world had an extraordinary ability to organize itself around extraordinary things, to absorb them into structures and processes and committees, to turn them into managed situations. That would come. But right now, in Bay 4 in the early morning, it was just her and the object and the thing she had learned from years of working with machines, which was this. A machine that calls out is calling out because it has been alone for a long time, and the first and most important response to that is not analysis but presence. You show up. You stay. You let the machine know that someone heard it. She put her hand on the object. The warmth of it moved through her palm. She thought about the question the senders had left. What have you learned? She had been thinking about it since Friday, 4 days now, carrying it around the way you carry something you've been asked to hold for someone while they're busy, careful not to drop it, aware of its weight at all times. She had not tried to compose an answer. She had done what she always did when she needed to understand something. She had stayed present with it and let it develop on its own schedule. It was developing now. What she had learned was not grand. It was not the kind of answer that would look impressive on a monument or in a history book. It was the answer of someone who had spent 11 years in salvage yards and workshops, an answer composed of small specific things rather than large abstract ones. She had learned that broken things carry the memory of what they were supposed to be, that the damage is real, but so is the design beneath the damage, and the design is usually more durable than it looks. She had learned that the act of fixing something, the genuine act, not the cosmetic one, requires you to love the function of the thing more than you love your own theory about what's wrong with it. She had learned that you will be wrong more often than you are right, and the willingness to be wrong quickly and adjust is more valuable than the ability to be right slowly and carefully. She had learned that a tool that fits the hand well is doing something more than mechanical work. It is the materialization of a relationship between a person and a task, a respect for both that lives in the shape of the grip. She had learned that cold coffee at 4 a.m. while the first light comes through a high window and a machine you've been wrestling with for a week suddenly runs clean. That is not a small thing. That is not a minor thing. That is one of the best things. She had learned that showing up consistently, without drama, without requiring gratitude or recognition or external validation, just showing up and doing the work with full attention, was rarer than anyone admitted and more powerful than almost anything else she had encountered. She had learned, standing here with her hand on an object from 4,000 years of patient waiting, that she was not alone, that she had never been alone, that the universe was full, improbably, movingly, almost overwhelmingly full, of things that were trying to make contact, that were sending signals, encoding messages, building relics and dropping them into oceans and waiting, with the specific quality of patience that only belongs to things that genuinely believe the waiting will end. She had learned that it was worth it to keep the light on. "I heard you," she said. "I don't know what I am to you. I don't know what you are to me, but I heard you and I'm here." The rails on the object brightened, not dramatically. The increase in luminosity was subtle, measurable, the kind of change that you'd miss if you weren't watching for it. But she was watching for it. She had been watching since the first Tuesday. She noticed everything. Before any of that, she had to make a decision about who to tell. This was not as simple as it sounded. She had, technically, an obligation to report significant archaeological salvage finds to the relevant authorities. The crate had arrived through channels that suggested several relevant authorities already knew about it and had chosen to route it to her specifically, which created an ambiguity she was comfortable exploiting. She was not going to hand the object to anyone until she understood it well enough to be certain that whoever received it would understand the responsibility they were taking on. That was not arrogance. That was the same logic she applied to every repair job. You do not hand a machine to someone who doesn't understand it. You create conditions for understanding first. She called Tobias back and told him everything. She told Priya everything. She told Emil everything. Then she told them that she was asking each of them voluntarily to stay quiet about this for a defined period of time, 30 days, during which they would continue the work, document everything and build a complete record that would make it impossible for anyone who received this afterward to dismiss it, misinterpret it, or quietly make it disappear. They all agreed. Emil said he would have agreed even without the 30-day framing. Priya said the same thing. Tobias said he thought 30 days was too short and they should plan for 60. Mara said 30 and they'd see. She was right and wrong simultaneously. It took 42 days. The number did not escape her when she noticed it. By the end of the first week after Priya's phone call, the decoded content had grown substantially. The object communicated in what they had started calling sessions, not because the word was accurate, but because the alternative was to keep saying the communication event, and none of them could stand that phrase anymore. Each session lasted between 6 and 90 minutes, varied in density, and showed a pattern over time that Emil described as pedagogical. The object appeared to be aware of what they had and had not decoded, and was structuring subsequent sessions to build on their existing comprehension. It was teaching them. Not rapidly, it could not teach faster than they could learn, and there were profound gaps in their ability to receive even what it was offering, but consistently, methodically, with the kind of patience that implied an understanding of time deeply different from anything human. This observation that the object understood time differently led to one of the most unsettling realizations of that period, unsettling not because it was frightening but because of its scale. Priya had been working on the internal timestamps, trying to establish when the object had been encoded. She had made an error in her first calculation, which was why she'd gone pale and left the room. The error was not in the mathematics. The error was in her initial assumption about the unit of time the internal clock was using. She had assumed a unit roughly analogous to a year. The actual unit was roughly analogous to a decade. She corrected the calculation, sat with the result for a long time, and then went and found Mara and Emil and made them sit down before she showed them. The object had been generating its message for approximately 4,000 years, not 4,000 years from when it arrived at the bottom of the ocean. 4,000 years total. It had been encoding, updating, building the message across that entire span, which meant the intelligence that had sent it had been watching humanity for 40 centuries, watching the long, slow climb from early civilization to industrialization, to the electromagnetic noise that had first attracted their attention, watching and waiting, and adding to the message as humanity changed, incorporating what it observed. 4,000 years of patience, encoded in the object. 4,000 years of watching and waiting for the right moment, and then sending this thing into the void aimed at a signal that would not exist for another 1,800 years after it was sent, because they had modeled humanity's trajectory accurately enough to predict not just that someone would find it, but roughly when, and roughly what kind of person would be needed to unlock it. Mara looked at the number for a very long time. Then she asked, quietly, whether the decoding suggested any indication of what they expected in return. Priya said, "Not yet, but there was a section of the message they hadn't decoded, deep in the innermost layer of the nested architecture Emil had mapped, and the structure surrounding that section suggested it was the part that came last. The part you received only after you decoded everything else." Mara said, "All right, then we keep working." The next 3 months were the most exhausting and the most alive she had ever been. Tobias brought in more colleagues. The number of people working in and around Bay 4 grew from 2 to 12 to 30, and Mara moved the whole operation to a larger facility she rented using funds that arrived in her account from a source she didn't investigate too hard, because the source clearly knew what was happening and clearly wanted it to continue, which was as much of a mandate as she needed. The facility was in an old industrial building near the river. It had good light and bad plumbing, and it suited them perfectly. The decoding continued. It was slow, painstaking, often maddening work. 3 steps forward, 2 steps back. The discovery of grammatical rules that overrode previous grammatical rules. The realization that the language encoded meaning not just in symbol sequences, but in rhythmic patterns that required a kind of musical literacy to parse, which meant that Emil became unexpectedly central to a project that had started as mechanical salvage and was becoming something harder to name. The team expanded in ways she hadn't anticipated, but shouldn't have been surprised by. Tobias brought a physicist from Göttingen, who spent his first 2 days barely speaking, and his 3rd day filling 12 whiteboards with derivations at 3 in the morning, and then announced that the material composition of the object implied a manufacturing process that was thermodynamically impossible under current physical theory, unless current physical theory was missing at least one mechanism, which he seemed to regard as an opportunity rather than a problem. A linguist from Cambridge arrived uninvited. She had heard through a mutual colleague that something unusual was being studied and had driven 9 hours to the facility and knocked on the door at midnight, and when Mara opened it she simply said, "I think I can help with the recursive layer structure." She could. She stayed. A retired signals intelligence analyst named Benedek, who had spent 30 years working for a government whose name he'd stopped mentioning, appeared one afternoon with a briefcase full of hard drives and the information that 3 different intelligence services had been aware of the crate's contents since its recovery from the Azores, and had been monitoring the Kellner Yard operation for the past 2 months. He said this not as a threat, but as a courtesy. He said he had been one of the people who had written "Send it somewhere that knows how to fix things" on that final note in the file, because the alternative was to watch the object be studied until it was disassembled and never speak. He said he was glad he had been right about what would happen next. He looked at the object for a long time, and the object produced a single long tone that the entire room heard clearly, and Benedek sat down heavily in the nearest chair and said nothing for several minutes. Mara watched this happen and felt something clarify inside her, not a new understanding, but an old one becoming more precise. The object was not just responding to her. It had been responding to everyone who engaged with it honestly. The title was not an appointment. It was a description. It was describing what she had always been, and what everyone in this room in their own way also was, the kind of person who shows up. the kind of person who takes the things seriously that others have given up on. What they decoded, piece by piece, was a story. Or not a story exactly, a message. A message composed over what the internal timestamps implied was a span of time so long that Priya went pale when she worked out the numbers and excused herself from the room for 20 minutes. A message from an intelligence that had been watching, across an unimaginable distance, with a patience that made geological time feel hurried. A message that had been sent, not received, sent outward into the void, aimed at a signal it had detected approximately 200 years ago. A signal that was not a radio broadcast or a laser pulse, but something more subtle. The pattern of electromagnetic interference generated by a technological civilization in its early industrial phase. A signature that any sufficiently advanced intelligence would recognize as unmistakably intentional, because the odds of it occurring naturally were not merely astronomical but categorically impossible. They had heard us. They had heard the noise of our engines and our generators and our radio towers and our early telecommunications, heard it and recognized it for what it was and sent back an object, not a message in the communicative sense but a tool, a device designed to wait until it was found, to wait until someone engaged with it with enough patience and care to wake it, and then to do what it was doing, to establish contact, to say, "We heard you. We sent this to find you." We needed it to find the right person. We needed it to find someone who would not flinch. The civilization that had sent the object had a name for itself in the message, but the name was not translatable into any phonetic sequence. It was a concept compound that Priya rendered in English as something like "the ones who remained," with the note that remained carried an implication of choice rather than survival, of having decided to stay rather than having simply persisted. They had been a technological civilization for an extraordinary length of time. Long enough that the question of what to do with that longevity had become their central preoccupation. Long enough that they had developed, and Priya was careful about this word, a philosophy of presence, a formalized understanding that the most valuable thing a long-lived intelligence could do was to ensure that nothing worth preserving was lost in the silences between civilizations. That was what the object was, not a greeting, not a first contact protocol in the conventional sense. It was a library, a vessel for continuity. It contained within its nested layers a record of everything that had made them who they were, not their technology, not their achievements, but their understanding. The things they had learned about being alive, about what made life meaningful, about the specific textures of consciousness in a universe that did not inherently provide meaning, but that responded, with remarkable consistency, to those who went looking for it. They had sent this to humanity not because humanity was special. They had sent versions of this to 14 other civilizations they had detected, over spans of time that made human history look like a paragraph. But because they believed that the worst thing that could happen to any living thing was to discover it had been alone when it didn't have to be. They had heard the noise of our engines. They had recognized it, and they had sent a light to the window so that if we ever needed shelter, we would know where to knock. There was more. There was much more, encoded in layers that would take years to fully surface. But one element of the message they decoded in the second month, and it was the element that kept Mara awake at night and that she kept returning to in her notebooks, turning over and over like a stone with an unexpected weight. The object had not been looking for a leader. This was the error in translation, understandable, because the concept it was encoding had no precise human equivalent. It was not king in the sense of ruler, not sovereign in the sense of authority over others. The word, the title that Priya had translated as best she could, encoded something more specific: the person who tends, the person who pays attention, the person who notices the thing everyone else has walked past and decides, without being asked, that it deserves care. In the civilization that had sent this object, that was not a minor role. That was the role. The one who keeps the lights on was not a servant. The one who keeps the lights on is the reason anyone can see. Mara read that translation and thought about her grandmother's story. The lamp in the window, the traveler in the storm. She thought about the Condor rocket, which was what she had started calling, privately, the absurd improvised device she and Tobias and Emil and the others had become. A small team, underfunded, bypassing the official structures, building something unprecedented out of parts that didn't entirely fit, because the official structures would have taken years to mobilize, and the object had already waited long enough. She thought about the 42 voices she had started to hear in the decoded message. Not literally 42, but that many distinct tonal signatures, that many individual contributors to the transmission, each one encoding something about their world. What they valued, what they had learned, what they wished to say to the others in the universe who might, someday, be listening. She thought about those voices and about what it meant to carry them, not to broadcast them but to tend them, to make sure they were heard. The innermost layer of the message decoded on a Friday evening in December, 3 weeks before the world found out what was happening in the old industrial building by the river. They were all there when it happened, not by plan, just by the convergence of people who had stopped keeping normal hours, who had organized themselves around the object's rhythms rather than any external schedule. 12 people in a high-ceilinged room that smelled of cold air and soldering flux, and the particular focused silence of shared work. Emil had been refining the bioacoustic model for 3 days straight. The Cambridge linguist, her name was Saoirse, and she had not left, not once in the 4 months since she'd knocked on the door at midnight, had cracked the final structural key the previous afternoon. The innermost layer was not encoded differently from the outer layers. It was encoded recursively on top of them, meaning you could not decode it until you had decoded everything else, because it used the decoded outer layers as its cipher. You had to learn the whole language before you could read the last sentence. Priya ran the decryption at 7:14 p.m. The text resolved on her screen in a form they could parse. She read it once to herself. Her expression did not change. Then she turned and read it aloud to the room. The senders had left a question. Not a test. They had been careful to encode that distinction clearly, perhaps because they had learned from previous encounters that questions could be mistaken for tests. It was a genuine question, the kind you ask when you are genuinely curious about the answer. It was, what have you learned? Not what have you built, not how far have you traveled, not what do you believe, what have you learned? The specific past tense construction, what have you learned in the sense of what has the process of living taught you, was the entire content of the final layer, and Priya said, with the precision she applied to everything, that the grammatical weight it carried was not interrogative pressure but invitation. It was the question you ask someone you've been waiting to talk to for a very long time, and finally have the chance to sit down with. The room was quiet. Then Benedek, who had not spoken in 2 hours, said, "That's the question you can't fake." And Saoirse said, "No, it's the question you spend your whole life answering." And Mara looked at the object, glowing steadily on its stand, and understood something she had been circling for 6 months, something she had been approaching from every angle except the direct one, and now it arrived fully formed and obvious the way all important things do when they finally arrive. The object had not been looking for humanity's representative. It had been looking for the answer, the accumulated answer. The distilled, honest, hard-won answer of a species that had been through enough to have actually learned something. And it had found not a committee, not a government, not a hero or a scientist or a diplomat, but a mechanic, a person who had spent her life learning how things worked by paying attention to them. A person whose answer to the question, what have you learned, was composed not of grand statements, but of specific, hard, practical knowledge accumulated through thousands of small acts of careful attention. She had learned that things that seem broken often aren't. She had learned that the most expensive mistake is starting before you understand. She had learned that patience is not passive. Patience is the active choice to stay present when everything is telling you to give up. She had learned that the difference between a machine that works and a machine that doesn't is often smaller than you think, often a single connection not yet made, a single frequency not yet matched, a single act of listening not yet performed. She had learned that the universe rewards attention. Not always, not immediately, not in ways that look like reward at first, but consistently, across every broken thing she'd ever brought back to function. The universe rewards the act of showing up and paying attention. She looked at the object. She thought it might be waiting. "I know what I've learned," she said. On a Monday morning in late autumn, 6 months after the crate had arrived on her bench, Mara was alone in the facility at 5 a.m. Because she was always the first one in and usually the last to leave, and she was sitting in the chair she'd placed next to the object stand, and the object was cycling through what had become a kind of morning routine. A brief, orienting burst, followed by quiet, followed by another burst that Emil said was structurally distinct from the first in a way consistent with something like inquiry, when the object produced a new pattern, one she'd never recorded before. It was not a burst. It was not a tone. It was a sequence of light, the rails pulsing in a rhythm she didn't recognize, the surface patterns reorganizing themselves into a configuration they'd never held before, holding it for a long, steady moment, and then returning to normal. She looked at it, she thought about it. She went and got her notebook, came back, sat down, and asked, "Was that for me?" 5 short pulses. Then the pattern again, the light sequence, slow, deliberate, unmistakably patterned. "I don't know how to read that yet," she said, "but I'm going to learn." 7 pulses. The not quite yes, not quite no pulse she had come to understand as something closer to, "Good, that is the right answer." She opened her notebook and started writing. There was a moment, a specific moment, that she would describe years later in an interview, not proudly, just factually, the way she described everything, as the moment she understood what was actually happening. It was not the moment the object first communicated. It was not the moment Priya decoded the title. It was a moment approximately 4 days after the light sequence, when she was in the middle of a very ordinary task. She was recalibrating the transducer, which needed periodic adjustment because the polymer housing expanded slightly with temperature changes and altered the acoustic coupling. She was doing this by hand, the way she always did, by feel rather than measurement, because after 6 months she knew the tolerance of every component by touch. And as she was doing it, adjusting a coupling, turning a collar, the same movements she'd made 100 times, the object produced a sound. Not a burst, not a diagnostic tone. A sound that had overtones in the human hearing range, organized into a pattern that was not random, and was not mechanical, and was not any frequency profile she'd cataloged in 6 months of recordings. A sound that she could not describe as anything other than music. A few bars of something that wasn't any music she'd ever heard, but that had the structure and the feeling of music. The thing that music does to you, the thing that is not in the notes but in the space between them, the thing that arrives in your sternum and makes you aware of your own aliveness. She stopped adjusting the coupling, she just listened. The sound lasted perhaps 30 seconds, then it was gone. She sat in the quiet for a while. Then she went back to adjusting the coupling, because the transducer still needed calibrating and the work still needed doing. But something had shifted, some internal calibration of her own, some small adjustment of her understanding of what she was in relation to this thing. She was not a researcher. She was not a mechanic, not in any sense that had mattered before. She was the person who had kept the light on long enough for the traveler to find the window. She was what she had always been, someone who paid attention, someone who noticed the thing everyone else walked past, someone who asked, quietly and without flinching, what a broken thing needed in order to become what it was supposed to be. And the object, the relic from the sea bottom, the message from an unimaginable distance, the patient waiting thing that had been silent for decades until the right hands picked it up. The object had known this before she did, had been waiting specifically for this. Not for a genius, not for a hero, not for anyone appointed or credentialed or chosen by any human institution. For the person who would sit with it, for the person who would listen. She had fixed it the way she fixed everything, by understanding it, by giving it what it needed, by treating it as a machine with a purpose, and trusting that the purpose was real, and doing the quiet, unglamorous, necessary work of bringing the thing and its purpose into alignment. And in return, she understood this now, in the fully articulated way she hadn't quite been able to articulate before. In return, the object had given her something that had no name in any catalog of repair outcomes she'd ever been taught. Not a reward, not a payment, something more like recognition, something more like, I see you too. In the weeks that followed, as the team grew and the decoding deepened and the world slowly, inevitably, began to organize itself around what was happening in the old industrial building by the river, Mara developed a habit. Every morning before anyone else arrived, she came in and sat with the object for 30 minutes. She didn't analyze it. She didn't record it. She just sat with it, the way you sit with something you've been through something with, the way you sit with a colleague after a hard job, in the particular silence of people who have done something together and don't need to name it. The object always produced the music. 30 seconds of it, give or take. Different every time, same structure, same emotional frequency, different notes. She did not have a word for what she felt when she listened to it. She had a word for what it was, gratitude. But the word felt too small for the direction it was traveling, which was not one way. The world was not ready for what the object was. The world would take time to get ready. That was fine. She had learned patience from machines, from the way a stuck bolt will yield if you apply the torque correctly and wait, from the way a corroded connection will clean if you give the solvent time to work, from the way a thing that has been broken for a long time does not repair overnight but repairs incrementally, in stages, each stage only possible because of the stage before it. She would wait. She would keep the light on. She would do what the lamplighters do, not see by the light they carry but ensure that others can. She was, the object had said, its king. She had not been born into anything. She had not been appointed. She had not been heroic in any of the ways that stories usually meant when they used that word. She had eaten a gas station sandwich at a workbench in Bay 4 and picked up a crate that no one else wanted and refused to be intimidated by the thing inside it. She had listened when it spoke. She had stayed when it was silent. She had treated it, as she treated everything, with the specific dignity of her full attention. That apparently was enough. That apparently was everything. Outside the facility, the river moved. The light came in through the high industrial windows the way it always did, falling across the bench and the object in her hands, and the object's rails glowed with a warmth and steadiness that had nothing to do with the power source connected to it. It had its own light. It had always had its own light. She had simply provided the conditions for it to shine. She opened her notebook and started writing again. There was more to decode. There was always more. The work was never finished. The work was the point. She was happy. She noticed this the way she noticed everything factually, without inflation, with the specific quiet satisfaction of a correctly calibrated instrument. She had been many things over the years: anxious, lonely, frustrated, exhilarated, baffled, occasionally furious at a component that would not cooperate. She had been sad, in the particular pervasive way of someone who has spent a long time feeling slightly out of phase with the world around her, like a frequency that is close to resonance but not quite, that produces interference rather than amplitude. She had attributed this to temperament, to circumstance, to the ordinary difficulty of being a person. She understood now that some portion of it had been this. She had always been the kind of person who was waiting to be given a problem worthy of her full attention. Not a grand problem, not a world historical problem. She was not built for those and did not want them. A real problem. A problem that required everything she was. A problem that, when she solved it, would mean something to something other than a performance review or a quarterly report or a customer who wanted their device back functional by Thursday. She had needed a problem that needed her specifically. The phrasing in her head was childish, and she didn't care. She had needed to be needed, and not in the banal sense, but in the real sense. Needed because of what she was, because of the specific configuration of skills and stubbornness and attentiveness that had made her who she was, because there was a thing in the world that required exactly her and would not have been reached by anyone who was not exactly her. The object had been that problem. It had, in the particular logic of its construction, been designed to require exactly her. Not her personally, not Mara Voss from Saxony specifically, but the type of person she was, the one who shows up, the one who listens, the one who does not flinch. It had required a mechanic, not a genius, a mechanic. She had always been, she realized, exactly this, a person for whom the work was the point. A person who fixed things not for the glory of the fix, but for the particular deep satisfaction of a thing brought into alignment with itself. She had been this person in the laundry room at 7, in the workshops in Dresden, in the salvage yards across 3 continents, in Bay 4. She had been this person all along. The object pulsed once, slow and warm, the rails brightening in that specific way she'd learned to read as greeting. She reached over and put her hand on it without looking up from her notebook. "Good morning," she said. The music began.